If you haven't heard, using AI can help you with your episode titles, descriptions, repurposing your content into a blog post, or even making a transcription into social media posts. Well, Notion, which is a free app that individuals can use, it's a database and research project. We actually talked about it in our podcast collaboration tools in the video above, but Notion actually just released Notion AI to the public. It's available to anyone. You can try it for free, and then if you'd like to use it long term, and we're going to show you lots of ways to use it, it's only $10 a month per user. Notion AI is actually one of the most inexpensive AI tools you can buy now, and if you already use Notion, or if you haven't yet, Notion is a great way to organize all of your projects and data, and now that the AI is just built into the document, it's super easy to use. Here's some things you can do with it. Here I am in a Notion document, and if I just press the space bar, it automatically activates the AI. It has lots of great starting points like brainstorming ideas, making a blog post, and even your recent queries are down below. Let's say we're starting a podcast, we know what it's about, but we're not sure about titles. Well, we can ask Notion AI to help us title our show. Let's write this prompt. What are 5 podcast title ideas for a show about iPhone, iPad? If I hit enter, the AI is going to think about it for a second, and then I'll get results right here on the page. And all of that was just generated by the Notion AI just from my prompt about what the show is called. Actually, I really like this idea, Apple Untold. So let's pretend that's the name of our show. Now I'd like to write a description so I can use in things like Apple Podcasts and Spotify based on what this is about. So now I'm going to ask Notion AI to write a podcast description for a show called Apple Untold that uncovers little-known facts and tips about Apple devices, iPhone, iPad, and Mac. I'll hit enter so the AI starts thinking. And now we have a full description. I can massage or change little things if I'd like to, and I can use this for my podcast description right here generated by Notion AI. I'm actually going to add a header, which Notion makes it really easy to add headers like with 2 number signs. I'll say this is my podcast description. And we'll even change the title of this document to Apple Untold because we're going to go with that name. Now we want to record our first few episodes, so let's ask Notion AI for some topic ideas based on this theme. So I asked Notion, what are podcast topic ideas based on untold or lesser known tips for iPhone, iPad, and Mac? So I really like this first topic idea. It says talk about using Siri, shortcuts in iOS and macOS, hidden settings that can improve your device's performance. So we're going to go with that as our topic for the first episode. And now I'll probably search for those tips on my own and pull those into the document. Let me ask Notion to write an intro to this episode, a script even that I could read to introduce this topic in the podcast. Hit the spacebar and I'll say, write a podcast intro script for an episode about. So now it's actually going to write a podcast intro script that I'll be able to read, and this will start off the podcast, the first episode. It's actually a pretty significant script. I could probably even shorten this if I'd like to, but I'll say, welcome to another episode of Apple Untold, the podcast that uncovers lesser known facts and stories about Apple devices. In today's episode, we're going to explore some hidden features that you may not be aware of. That sounds like a pretty good podcast intro to me. Now, one of the things I want to cover in this episode is battery life on iPhone. So I'm actually going to write a couple of the tips that I found and see if Notion AI can actually make that into a blog post. This way I have more content I can put on my website in addition to the podcast. So I found some tips and I want to make this into a blog post. So I'll say, write a 500-word blog post on optimizing iPhone battery life, including these tips. Shorten your auto lock time and display settings, disable location services for apps that don't need it, and enable low power mode. Let's see what Notion AI does with that. All right, this is pretty wild. It actually wrote an entire blog post and even added more tips that I didn't even prompt it with. So here it talks about shortening your auto lock time. It even put the proper hierarchy to find that setting on your iPhone. It talked about disabling location services. Again, even put where to find that in your iPhone settings. It talked about low power mode, and it even gave other tips and tricks for helping your battery life on your iPhone. I now have a blog post based on the same topics of my podcast, and I can repurpose that content. Now, even within the Notion AI, you can actually choose to make shorter or make longer, whatever it is you just did. You can simplify the language or change the tone if you want to go for a more professional, casual, confident. So I'm actually going to highlight the text that was my blog post specifically, and now I can choose Ask I based on just the text I selected. And with that text highlighted, I'll ask the Notion AI create 5 social media posts. I'll hit enter, and now it's going to formulate some of that information into social media posts. Now I have 5 social media posts that I can use to advertise this blog post or my podcast episode. Now, Notion is great for planning long-term if you want to plan multiple episodes and even collaborate with some of your other co-hosts and guests. I'm just going to simply ask it to plan 4 episodes of the Apple Untold podcast. Again, I love some of these titles like Mastering Siri, iPhone Photography Tips. We haven't even covered that yet in this document. Again, maximizing your iPhone battery life, covering what we did in the blog post. And I can just keep asking it for more ideas. Now, finally, let's say I actually want to interview someone on my Apple Untold podcast. Let's see if Notion AI can actually suggest some names for people I can ask to interview. I'm going to ask Notion AI what are some great interview guests to discuss Apple devices and iPhone. Even as I was typing these names, I actually follow all of these guys. John Gruber writes Daring Fireball, one of the biggest Apple blogs and podcasts out there. Federico Viticci, he does a lot of iPad and shortcut stuff. Love that recommendation. Honestly, these are some great suggestions for people to interview on this show. One last prompt. I want to see if you can help me figure out questions to ask one of these guests if they come on the show. So my last prompt, what are 10 questions to ask Federico Viticci about iPad productivity? I know that's kind of one of his specialties. Let's see what it comes out. Again, great questions here. How do you organize your iPad home screen, your favorite keyboard shortcuts, multitasking, favorite apps for productivity? Honestly, these are incredible suggestions for an interview, and now I've planned multiple episodes of this podcast. I have my podcast title, description, a blog post to go along with it, and even social media posts to use to advertise my podcast. Again, Notion AI is a powerful tool to use in an application you might already be using for collaboration, research, and note-taking. You can learn more about Notion AI in the link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Riverside channel. If you're starting a podcast, or maybe you want to add video to your podcast, we have lots of content on building your video podcast setup, lighting, automating your podcast workflow, and a ton more. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next video.